Now, whilst I do not claim to be an expert in farming or climate change, I do know people who are, and they were consulted in order to give accurate information in this speech. But at the end of the video, I'm going to put some clips from a real live farmer explaining exactly how awful it is in farming right now. Also at the end, there's going to be a climate change quiz for councillors. Let's test their knowledge, shall we? Good evening. Are you aware of the plight our farmers are facing? It's not just cheap imports and supermarket exploitation that's destroying the farming industry, but UN directives. Instead of helping farmers transition away from chemicals over to natural regenerative agriculture, our government is being directed to pay farmers to stop farming food to save the planet. We should be preserving biodiversity in areas like Middlewick, not sacrificing the farmland that feeds us. The ever-increasing net zero bureaucracy is driving up the cost of food production, which farmers aren't properly compensated for, and they cannot continue. So the question is, do you know what net zero looks like in real terms? Starting from 2030, all flying, shipping, food imports and homegrown beef and lamb to be phased out, with the majority of UK farmland going over to wind and solar farms. How is covering our beautiful countryside in toxic solar panels, environmentally harmfully mined lithium batteries and wind turbines, all difficult to recycle, saving the planet? And saving it from what exactly? CO2, the vital gas that keeps plants and us alive, which has been at record lows for centuries. Provably, CO2 simply isn't a strong enough forcing agent for the warming we're being told to be so fearful of, and neither is methane. More people die in cold weather than warm. Melting sea ice will not cause a rise in sea level. Only land ice is capable of that, which did not happen during the Holocene maximum, when Arctic temperatures were much higher than now. The net zero industry is worth trillions, over $4 billion a day in revenue. That kind of money buys an awful lot of science and influence. Ethical scientists easily disprove the nonsense of net zero. Those scientists aren't included on mainstream media, but their peer-reviewed research papers found easily enough online for those who bother to look. But that's the problem. Few bother to look. Did you, before you voted to declare a climate emergency? Please raise your hand if you did. One. Net zero will destroy our farming industry. If people are forced to choose between feeding their family and paying council tax, which do you think they are going to pick? Assuming, of course, there's enough food, which will be difficult without farmers. Food is one of the 13 critical national infrastructures as set out by the National Protective Security Authority, which councils are supposed to consider. Yet I couldn't see a mention of food security in any of the local plan documents. It needs to be included. Councillors must have the ability to turn down planning applications that threaten our food security. So will you include it? Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. You do bring us stimulating alternative views of ours, or mainstream. I think all I can say is we hear what you're saying to us as a reminder, of course, of a reality. Land supply and farm and produce have always mattered. I think, for my part, that it's highly unlikely that the majority of land will ever be put over to wind and solar, but it is a fair point for us all to note many pressures, including ones that you've described. And I'm sure that the local planning committee will have an opportunity to consider this when they meet. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor King.
I have a map of Somerset. I can't find Essex, but I will show you just how much they're going to do to our farmland.
Right.
It's quite horrific. For those of you that saw the interview I did with Sandy Adams, she gave me this map. So this is North Somerset, and if you look closely, all the pink areas are the potential sites for photovoltaic, so solar, and all the red are large wind turbines, and the orange and yellow are the smaller wind turbines. So as you can see, that covers pretty much the whole of North Somerset. This is what it looks like now, lovely lush farmland, and that's what it could look like. Now you'll notice they used the word potential. That doesn't necessarily mean they would use all of that space, but the problem we have is Energy supply is, of course, critical infrastructure, so it goes through planning easily. Now, when it's on the local plan, it's even harder to turn it down. So there's no way of guaranteeing they won't cover all of this land as it's set out on this plan unless you have food security in the local plan as well. Then you've got grounds to turn down planning for it. But if you don't, you won't be able to stop it if they do decide they're going to cover every last square inch. Frankly, they're going to need to, because we're just not going to have enough power. And even if they do, it still won't be enough. Because if we don't put these safeguards in place, then you can say goodbye to the countryside. Incidentally, you can no longer find this map on the North Somerset website because they've taken it down after Sandy Adams started talking about it publicly. For anyone who doesn't realise just how impossible it is to supply the country with renewable electricity, I will link in the video description to a talk by the wonderful Ralph Ellis, who is a climate scientist, pilot, polymath, historian, author, an all-round very clever guy, who is one of our climate advisors, and he will walk you through the madness of it all. Few people, especially councillors, realise the full extent of what net zero really means for us all. And few people realise just how bad solar and wind farm technology is. The green tech isn't anywhere near as green as we've been led to believe. And I'm speaking as somebody who was a big fan of renewables for over 20 years, until the day I actually bothered to research properly how they are made. And the way they get us on this is it's a lovely idea to be able to harness energy from the sun and the wind and have it be clean and renewable. But if you take into account the production, the pollution and the difficulty recycling, that is simply not the reality. Green technologies at the moment are not green. And the more we invest in these substandard technologies, the less money there will be to develop truly clean energy. So, Colchester councillors, you have taken it upon yourselves to declare a climate emergency, and out of the 51 of you, only one bothered to look at dissenting information. It's not really good enough, is it? And your climate emergency officers, through 9 months of emails backwards and forwards, which you can see in the Dropbox resource folder, email stream number 2, haven't been able to prove it other than to send me to the IPCC, who use cherry-picked start dates for their data and very flawed computer modelling. And incidentally, they themselves have never actually declared a climate emergency. So why did you? So councillors, I have a CO2 climate quiz for you. Let's test how knowledgeable you really are about CO2. Question 1. Now on this graph you can see a very clear correlation between temperature and CO2 levels. But if we home in, you can see the reality is that temperature goes up between 400 and 800 years before CO2 levels. So please can you explain how CO2 can be a driver of temperature increase when it goes up after the temperature increase? Question 2. This chart shows the last 600 million years. The blue line represents temperature and the purple line represents CO2. So could you please explain how CO2 is driving up temperature when 600 million years of data shows the complete opposite? When temperatures are high, CO2 is low, and when temperatures are low, CO2 is high. Question 3. Why do you think higher levels of CO2 are dangerous? As you can see, nearly 550 million years ago, it was just under 8,000 parts per million. Currently, we're about 420. In fact, we've been dangerously close to all plant life extinction levels. So why do you want CO2 to go down to such dangerous levels? Are you suicidal? Question 4. What is your proof CO2 is causing warming rather than oceanic cycles, solar cycles, or ice sheet albedo? Question 5. Why do you trust data that has been manipulated and also flawed computer models that have been wrong for decades? Are you hoping for next decade lucky? Now there's 11 pages of wildly inaccurate climate predictions on this website. I will link to them, and you can have a good read through just how many times the so-called science has been completely wrong. Are you relying on the law of averages that at some point they might actually get one right? So if you wish to believe CO2 is the cause of climate change, when you are in your personal private capacity, go right ahead. We have no issue with that whatsoever. Your beliefs are your own. But when you are working for us, we do require you to make unbiased, evidence-based decisions. So please prove that CO2 is the cause of global warming before you bankrupt and starve us all. Because this video hasn't even really scratched the surface of the delights net zero brings. They are trying to persuade the exceptionally gullible that growing your own vegetables is bad for the environment, and that our pets need to go because of the carbon footprint their diet is causing.
We farm just outside Cambridge. We're farming 12,500 acres. The European counterparts, they're still receiving subsidy, which they get to effectively put cheap food on the shelves. The UK has the taps turned off, and we're down to sort of 25% of what it was. And we're having imports coming in from Europe and other countries, which we're struggling to compete with. And farming is really now in a very difficult time. And 49% of farmers are now saying that they don't know if they'll be in business next year. And we've got just over 30% of farmers have left the industry since 2001, when the government organisation DEFRA was set up, which was basically the beginning of the focus away from production agriculture, putting food on the plate and into the stores and going down the environmental route. And now it's bionet gain, and we're talking about carbon, and it's all focuses away from food production. And they're encouraging people to not farm. So just to put it into perspective, we ran through the numbers last week, and if we went on the SFI and got out of farming in the activity of growing food, we would be 4 times more profitable than we are today. And actually today of this year, we're losing money. So it would be better for me not to farm. But if I get out, we won't be going back in. I desperately want to farm, and I want there to be a future for generations after me. Fundamental problems are that farmers are only getting 1 pence in the pound. So it's actually what the farmer's receiving, in line with actually what the public are paying in the supermarkets. I mean, Tesco's, for example, last year reported 2.7 billion profit. Well, I mean, that's extraordinary when you've got farms up and down the country which aren't making profit, or they're not really paying themselves. If they were to put, say, minimum wage into related to the hours they did, their businesses would be losing money hand over fist.
You mentioned Tesco there because they're not even paying their staff enough wages, so that they have to claim working tax benefits. So the taxpayer is actually subsidizing the dividends that Tesco is paying to its shareholders. But at the same time, they're also squeezing farmers like you.
Well, the supermarkets, I mean, we all shop in them, and we all have done. But if anybody has had anything to do with a supermarket, they probably haven't got anything pleasant to say about them. They've been a necessity evil for farming, because of course they buy in bulk. But actually in turn, what they've done is they've eroded all of the margins of what the farmer would get paid. They then said, well, we want to go to an open book policy. Let's look at what it costs you to do, and then we'll give you 1p, for example. That's no way to carry on in a business. I am a farmer, and I'm proud to produce food, and I'm proud that is my contribution to the public and to being part of society. Environment gets looked after separately, as it always has done, because every farmer wants to make sure whatever they hand over is in better condition than when they got it. But nowadays, the government seems to have a complete focus on not farming, and which I think food security should be the highest priority, especially with the amount of wars and unsettlement we've got around the world going on now. Even more so. And then introducing a system that pays people not to farm. Of course, then everybody's going to have to go down that route, because they're going to financially have no choice, or they're going to go bankrupt.
So incredibly tough times for our farmers right now. But to end on a positive note, there are people behind the scenes working night and day to help the farmers out of this situation. I will tell you more about that in a future video. So there is an action plan being formed to bypass these unscrupulous supermarkets and help farmers get their food directly to the public. And I will share more with you as soon as I can. But it's going to come down to us all to make this work and change our lifelong habits of convenience over to helping and supporting one another. For those of you with a dark sense of humour, you might appreciate this from AI when it did the transcript of that farmer talking about DEFRA being set up. you.